Have you ever imagined a millionaire stopping in front of the simplest scene? A cleaning woman eating alone under the rain, and realizing that he was the one who was truly starving? Not for food, but for meaning. Sometimes it's the smallest, most unnoticed gesture that breaks the coldest heart and awakens something money could never buy: humanity. This is the story of Alexander Reed, a man surrounded by luxury yet imprisoned by emptiness. Everything changes the day he sees Sophia Morales, his cleaning woman, choosing to sit in the rain so she wouldn't dirty the staff's dining room. From that moment on, the ruthless millionaire begins to discover the true value of humility, pain, and forgiveness. So before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you don't miss stories that transform. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I want to know how far this rain can reach. The millionaire Alexander Reed lived surrounded by everything luxury could offer, yet his home was as cold as the marble that covered it. Every corridor of the mansion seemed to echo the silence that had followed him since the loss of his wife. The sound of his footsteps resonated through glass walls that never allowed the sun to truly warm them. He believed control was synonymous with safety, and that affection was a luxury he could no longer afford. In the hills of Beverly Hills, the name Alexander Reed was a symbol of power. The millionaire ran one of the largest luxury construction companies in the United States, and his reputation as a ruthless man crossed borders. Everyone feared him. Few understood him. He treated his employees with the same precision he used to sign contracts. No room for mistakes, no space for bonds. Even so, the glass mansion carried a loneliness he couldn't command. The mirrored windows reflected his own absence, and the antique clocks he collected marked the passage of a life he no longer lived. His routine was exact, almost mechanical. Coffee at 6, meetings at 9, silence at 10. Order was the only way he knew how to coexist with emptiness. It was within this setting that Sophia Morales appeared. The new housekeeper carried with her an uncommon calm, a kind of serenity that clashed with the rigidity of that house. The other employees spoke of her quiet kindness, the gentle way she spoke, the care she put into every detail. Alexander, however, saw nothing more than a worker following orders. Or at least, that's what he tried to believe. As she cleaned the crystal staircases and arranged each piece of silver, Sophia seemed to illuminate the space without even noticing. Her presence filled the mansion with something immeasurable, perhaps humanity. She never rushed, never complained, and still found time to hum softly as she worked. The mansion began to change, but Alexander couldn't understand why. Days passed, and the routine remained almost unchanged. Yet the millionaire began to notice subtle differences: the aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the faint sound of a melody, the lighter mood among the staff. It was as if the arrival of that housekeeper had breathed life into what had once been only structure and silence. Alexander watched from a distance, unwilling to admit the curiosity growing inside him. Sophia treated everyone with the same respect, regardless of status or wealth. There was dignity in every gesture, a kind of nobility he never found at the lavish parties of the elite. And that quiet simplicity began to unsettle him in ways he couldn't explain. The home that had once been his refuge began to feel like a mirror. In every polished corner, every shining surface, Alexander saw reflections of himself, a man trapped inside his own wealth. The millionaire, who had always believed that money brought power, was beginning to feel the weight of having everything and yet being utterly alone. Then came the day when something changed. From the window of his office, between papers and profits, Alexander saw Sophia outside, standing in the rain. The scene was simple but powerful. The housekeeper, sitting on the wet ground, eating a sandwich in silence. She was there, not complaining, simply existing. And for the first time in a long while, the millionaire felt his chest tighten, without knowing why. The afternoon in Beverly Hills was gray, the kind of day when even the wind seems tired. From the top floor of his glass office, the millionaire Alexander Reed watched the rain fall over the mansion's gardens. The droplets slid slowly down the windows like traces of time, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't look away. Then something caught his eye. A lone figure sitting on the wet ground near the side entrance. It was Sophia Morales, the housekeeper, eating a simple sandwich wrapped in paper. She was hunched over, shielding the food from the rain with one hand while holding a broken umbrella with the other. There was no rush in her movements, only calm acceptance. The contrast between that modest scene and the surrounding luxury was almost symbolic. A small gesture that somehow broke the silence in two. Alexander frowned, puzzled. That woman who worked in one of the most opulent homes in California was sitting there in the rain, not complaining, not seeking shelter. It intrigued him. He who dined at crystal tables with golden cutlery was now watching a housekeeper savor a humble meal as if it were a feast. It was an image no amount of money could replicate. Rainwater streamed through Sophia's dark curls, heavy and damp, falling across her serene face. Still, she smiled faintly as if accepting life just as it came. Alexander noticed that she preferred to get wet rather than dirty the staff's cafeteria with her muddy boots. There was discipline in that choice, a quiet dignity that needed no audience. He couldn't explain it, but the sight unsettled him. For a moment, he forgot about the unfinished emails, the stacked reports, the luxury watch on his wrist. Everything around him seemed to slow down. The image of the housekeeper, alone and calm under the rain, passed through his mind like a flash of something priceless. The mansion, once so imposing, suddenly seemed smaller, and the sound of the rain, once bothersome, now felt almost melodic. The millionaire stood up, walked closer to the glass, and observed in silence. Outside, Sophia tore her sandwich in half and shared it with a small bird that had approached for crumbs. It was a simple act, but with immense meaning. The generosity of someone who has little but still chooses to give. Alexander looked away, as if something deep within him refused to keep watching. For years, he had believed that gestures didn't change anything, that the world was built on transactions, not intentions. Yet there, in that quiet scene, a strange discomfort stirred inside him. A weight in his chest, subtle but persistent. It was as if a forgotten part of himself had just awakened without asking for permission. Sophia didn't know it, but in that silent moment, she had created the first crack in the glass surrounding his heart. Minutes later, she stood up, dusted off her hands, adjusted her hair, and returned to work. No words, no drama, just quiet normality. But the image stayed with Alexander, looping in his mind like an echo. He tried to dismiss it, but something within him whispered that this could not be ignored. When night fell and the sound of rain still drummed against the mansion's windows, Alexander couldn't sleep. The image of the housekeeper sitting in the rain haunted him like a memory that refused to fade. That same night, unable to rest, he called his assistant and said firmly, "Find out who she is." The next morning, the millionaire Alexander Reed arrived at his office earlier than usual. The sleepless night had left dark circles under his eyes, yet the image of the housekeeper in the rain refused to leave his mind. It replayed with an almost painful clarity. Sitting before his computer, he gave his assistant a short command. "I want a full report on Sofia Morales." Hours later, a brown envelope rested on his glass desk. The sound of the paper tearing open cut through the silence of the room. Inside, a simple file, date of birth, address, work history. No scandals, no complaints, just an ordinary life. A single mother, a legal immigrant, 2 jobs, and a 12-year-old daughter named Emily. Everything about Sophia was modest, but her simplicity made her even more intriguing. Alexander read every line with precision. He discovered that Sophia worked nights at a community laundromat and studied to finish her technical degree. Her hours of rest were almost non-existent, yet there were no complaints, no requests, no traces of self-pity. He paused, absorbing the information. He was used to people lying for advantage, but here was someone simply surviving with dignity. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and looked at his reflection on the glass surface. The mansion, the company, the investments, none of it seemed to matter at that moment. He thought about how many times he had judged people by what they owned, never by what they endured. And the more he read about the housekeeper, the more he realized that perhaps she understood the meaning of worth better than he ever had. He began observing her discreetly over the next few days. He noticed how she treated others, always respectfully, calling them by name, helping whenever she could without expecting anything in return. It was a striking contrast to the competitive, artificial world he inhabited. She didn't talk about ambition, but about duty. She didn't act out of vanity, but out of purpose. The millionaire started noticing details he had once overlooked. The worn gloves, the mended uniform, the tired but serene eyes. She carried the weight of life without complaint. He who had everything was now realizing how blind he had been to the quiet strength of ordinary people. It was as if he were facing a mirror that forced him to confront his own fragility, hidden beneath the glow of power. One afternoon, as he walked through the main hall, Alexander saw Sophia talking with one of the gardeners. She laughed at something simple, a soft, genuine laugh that seemed to fill the space with light. He stopped unseen and watched silently. That sound echoed strangely inside him, as if it filled an emptiness long ignored. For the first time, he felt control slipping from his hands, but fate has a way of testing the heart's awakening. Just a few days later came the company's annual charity gala, the most luxurious event of the year. Halls filled with business magnates, glittering dresses, cameras, and champagne glasses raised in celebration. Sophia was among the staff, cleaning and organizing quietly as always, and it was there amid the glamour and music that destiny decided to intervene. In the midst of applause and laughter, a single incident changed everything. A distracted guest stumbled, spilling a tray of champagne flutes. Within seconds, every gaze turned towards Sophia. She tried to explain, but her words vanished under the polite murmur of judgment. And in that moment, standing among the elite, Alexander watched, torn between his public image and the unfamiliar instinct stirring inside him. The grand ballroom of Beverly Hills' most luxurious hotel shimmered under golden lights. The annual Reed Enterprises Gala gathered politicians, businessmen, and celebrities, all dressed to impress. The millionaire Alexander Reed moved among them with his usual air of control, greeting familiar faces with rehearsed smiles. Around him, the sound of glasses blended with the soft notes of a string quartet. The evening seemed perfect, at least on the surface. Among the staff, discreet and efficient, was Sophia Morales. She wore a spotless black uniform, her hair tied neatly in a simple bun, her gaze alert to every detail. The housekeeper moved with the lightness of someone well acquainted with the weight of labor. She passed almost unnoticed among waiters and organizers, blending into the background as if she were part of the decor itself. Just another invisible worker, but not for long. While Alexander discussed figures and investments with fellow magnates, his eyes drifted briefly toward a corner of the room. There was Sophia, quietly fixing a fallen tablecloth, careful not to draw attention. For a second, something in her calm posture caught his eye. The same quiet grace he had seen in the rain. But the clinking of glasses brought him back to reality. His public image had to remain untarnished, and he knew that better than anyone. The music swelled, cameras flashed, and a distracted waiter crossed paths with an impatient guest. In a careless motion, the tray slipped. Crystal flutes shattered, champagne splashed, and golden liquid spread across the marble floor. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. In the midst of the chaos, Sophia hurried forward, kneeling to clean before anyone could slip. But fate was unkind. The guest, a powerful investor, turned sharply and pointed at her.
"Look what you've done!"
he barked, loud enough to silence the orchestra. The entire ballroom froze. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Sophia stood there, hands wet, eyes wide, unable to speak. Embarrassment wrapped around her like a shroud. From across the room, Alexander watched. He saw the fear in her eyes, the involuntary flush, the forced silence. Each word the man spoke cut through the air, sharper than the music. Alexander could have stepped in, but he didn't. He stood paralyzed between two worlds, pride and compassion. Any action he took would be noticed, judged, perhaps twisted. And for that single moment, he chose silence. Sophia rose slowly, her head held high. Her voice trembled as she tried to apologize, but her eyes said what words could not. Dignity. She gathered the shards of glass, wiped the marble clean, and walked away in silence. Behind her, whispers replaced the tension. The sound of elegant laughter echoed, cold and hollow. The orchestra resumed, but the atmosphere never recovered. Alexander felt the full weight of his silence. Every note sounded like a reminder of cowardice. While the guests returned to their polished conversations and shallow ease, he couldn't shake the image of the housekeeper humiliated beneath the lights of a ballroom he had paid for. When the event ended and the applause faded, Alexander stood motionless before the empty stage. The marble floor, gleaming under golden light, mocked the perfection he valued so much. Hours later, back at his mansion, Sophia's face still haunted him. And at dawn, an anonymous envelope lay on her table, containing a letter and a check, a gesture meant to heal but destined to wound even deeper. Morning light filtered through the wide glass windows of Alexander Reed's mansion, revealing the cold reflection of the polished surfaces around him. On the kitchen table of the servants' quarters lay a plain envelope. Inside it, a neatly written letter and a generous check. It was the silent attempt of a millionaire trying to fix what money could never truly repair. But guilt seldom blossoms into forgiveness. When Sofia Morales found the envelope, she hesitated before opening it. Her fingers lingered, as if they already knew what waited inside. Upon reading, her eyes narrowed, not in shock but in quiet disappointment. Without a word, she tore the check in half, the sound of the paper cutting through the silence. It was the gesture of someone who had learned to live with little, yet refused to live without dignity. Hours later, Sofia walked purposefully down the mansion's marble corridor, her steps steady. Alexander, in the middle of a virtual meeting, froze when she entered. The air shifted. She placed the torn envelope on his desk and said calmly, "I don't want your charity." Her voice was firm, her tone unshaken. The words fell heavy, like glass cracking from the inside. Alexander tried to explain. He said it wasn't pity but respect, that the gesture came from acknowledgement, not superiority. Yet the more he spoke, the clearer the distance between their worlds became. She wasn't seeking help, she was defending her worth. And he was beginning to realize that dignity was something no amount of wealth could buy. A thick silence followed. Sofia looked away, inhaled deeply, then said softly, "I work to live, Mr. Reed, not to be reminded of what I don't have." The millionaire felt something twist inside him. For the first time, someone spoke to him without fear, without pretense, without flattery, and strangely, it disarmed him more than any insult ever could. When she left, the office seemed smaller. Alexander sat alone, staring at the torn envelope on his desk. Outside, the faint sound of rain began to tap against the glass, a coincidence he couldn't ignore. He walked to the balcony, searching for clarity, but found only his reflection, a man who had mistaken power for purpose. Later that afternoon, he wandered through the garden and saw Emily, Sofia's daughter, sitting beneath a tree. The girl was drawing in a colorful notebook, completely absorbed in her world. Alexander approached quietly and asked what she was working on. "It's a picture of my dad," she said without looking up. Curious, he crouched beside her. The drawing was simple but full of warmth. A man in a firefighter's uniform, smiling, kind-eyed, standing beside a little girl. Alexander felt his heartbeat quicken. Something about that face tugged at the edges of memory. A familiarity buried under years of ambition. For a moment, the millionaire was no longer a man of glass and gold, but a boy remembering what courage once meant. Emily looked up and smiled. "Mom says he was very brave." Alexander nodded slowly, unable to speak. A soft breeze flipped one of the notebook's pages, revealing another picture: fire, smoke, rain, and rescue. And then he froze. He recognized that name, that face, that sacrifice. The puzzle snapped into place. Their lives had crossed long before this quiet afternoon in the garden. The sunset painted the mansion's garden in shades of soft orange and gold. Alexander Reed was still crouched beside Emily, staring at the drawing of the firefighter. The wind turned the pages of her notebook, revealing sketches simple yet full of feeling. The girl spoke about her father with the ease of someone who had learned to live with absence. Each word she uttered seemed to open a window inside the millionaire's heart. As he listened, Alexander tried to recall where he had seen that face before. The smile, the determined eyes, the uniform. There was something painfully familiar about it. Then, amid the colored lines and childlike innocence, he saw the name written neatly in the corner: Michael Harris Morales. For a moment, the world fell silent. He knew that name. He owed his life to it. The memory came like a flood. Years ago, on a stormy night, Alexander's car had skidded off the road and caught fire at the bottom of a ravine. His young daughter was trapped inside the wreckage. It was a firefighter who saved her, and died trying to rescue another person. Now that name on the paper tied the past and present together with an invisible thread of fate. The millionaire stood up slowly, eyes distant. Emily looked up, curious, unaware of the storm quietly building inside him. The air around them felt thicker, heavy with remembrance. Alexander ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and said softly, "Your father, he was an extraordinary man. His voice carried reverence, not pity. That night, sleep refused to come. Alexander sat by the fire in his office, the flames reflecting in the glass walls around him. On his desk lay Sophia's file, open once more. The name Michael Harris Morales seemed to pulse from the page. Memories of that night returned vividly. The smoke, the sirens, the screams. For the first time in years, he cried. Not from loss, but from the weight of unspoken gratitude. And in that fragile moment, understanding struck. The housekeeper he had humiliated was the widow of the man who had saved his child. The woman he had ignored carried the same quiet courage that had once faced death for a stranger. And the little girl who drew under the tree, she was the living bridge between sacrifice and redemption. Nothing in his life was coincidence anymore. At dawn, the millionaire wandered the silent corridors of his mansion. Every reflection in the glass seemed to watch him. The walls, once symbols of control and perfection, now mirrored his fragility. Wealth had given him everything except meaning. And for the first time, guilt began to turn into purpose. Alexander stopped by the window of his office, looking out over the city below. A thin rain had begun to fall, its rhythm echoing through the stillness. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called Eleanor Grant, his trusted assistant. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need you to take care of something personal. There's a family that needs our help." He hung up and stood in silence. Outside, the sky darkened slowly. For the first time in many years, Alexander Reed made a promise. Not to a deal, not to a company, but to himself. He would protect that family no matter the cost. Not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. Because at last, the millionaire had recognized the face the mirror had long refused to show him. The face of the man he could still become. The days that followed brought a strange silence to the mansion. Alexander Reed, the millionaire who once controlled everything with surgical precision, now acted in secret. While Sophia Morales continued her humble routine, he quietly moved invisible threads to lighten her burden. He paid Emily's school tuition anonymously, had their old house repaired, and left supplies by the door, all without revealing his name. It was his way of trying to fix what money had never been able to heal: guilt. He truly believed that this time he was doing the right thing. But good intentions, when wrapped in secrecy, can sound like pity. And to a woman who had built her life with her own hands, pity was more painful than poverty. When Sophia found out what he had done, it felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. In her trembling hands were the school receipt and the house renovation bill. Her heart pounded with a mix of anger and confusion. Why would he do this? She whispered to herself. Gratitude and resentment clashed inside her. The eternal battle of pride versus vulnerability. That evening, she went to the mansion. The rain was pouring, the sky a mirror of her turmoil. When Alexander saw her at the door, soaked and holding the papers, something broke inside him. Before he could speak, she shouted, "You think you can buy everything, don't you?" Her voice echoed through the marble halls, carried by the thunder. He tried to explain. Said it wasn't about money, it was about respect, about gratitude. But she wasn't listening. "Respect doesn't come with a check, Mr. Reed," she snapped. The words sliced through him like glass. For the first time, he realized he'd been trying to pay for something that required something far more precious: humility. Sophia turned to leave, her eyes filled with tears, yet her posture unshaken. Alexander took a step forward, his hand half raised, but no words came out. The sound of rain against the glass mocked his helplessness. When the door closed, the mansion became what it had always been: cold, silent, filled with reflections of a man who no longer knew himself. Hours later, Alexander stood on the balcony, the wind biting through his shirt. Her words echoed in his mind like a sermon. "You think you can buy everything." Each syllable stripped away another layer of illusion. For the first time, he didn't see himself as a millionaire, but as a man emptied of meaning, standing in the ruins of his own pride. Meanwhile, Sophia walked home through the storm, clutching her coat tight. Her umbrella barely held against the wind. Beneath the anger, something else stirred: guilt. Deep down, she knew Alexander wasn't driven by arrogance, but by regret. Yet when pride and pain mix, even the purest heart becomes blind for a while. And then, in the middle of the night, Alexander's phone rang. The voice on the other end trembled with urgency. "Mr. Reed, there's been a fire. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The words echoed through the dark office, mingling with the steady rhythm of rain. Everything inside him went still, except one thought that roared from within. Sophia. The phone was still vibrating on the table when Alexander Reed rushed out of the mansion. Rain lashed against the streets of Beverly Hills, the drops reflecting the red and blue lights of distant sirens. The millionaire's heart pounded as if trying to make up for years of silence. He drove without thinking, the car sliding across the wet asphalt, the city dissolving into flashes of lightning and memory. By the time he arrived, flames had already engulfed the small building where Sofia Morales and her daughter lived. Fire climbed the walls like furious hands reaching for the sky. Neighbors shouted names, firefighters fought the inferno, chaos reigned. Alexander jumped out of the car and ran through the barricade, ignoring the men yelling for him to stop. Instinct had completely taken over. And there she was, Sophia in the middle of the chaos, helping an elderly woman escape an apartment filled with smoke. Her hair, soaked by rain and sweat, clung to her face. Her clothes were torn and covered in soot, but her eyes still burned with fierce determination. She coughed, barely breathing, yet she refused to stop. It was as if the storm itself was pushing her forward. Alexander saw her and shouted her name, but she didn't hear him. The roar of fire, the screaming, the crackling of wood drowned out every sound. He forced his way through the smoke, his skin stinging from the heat. When he finally reached her, he grabbed her arm. "Sophia, get out of there!" His voice broke, half command, half plea. She resisted, pointing toward the old woman on the floor behind her. Without a second thought, Alexander went back inside and lifted the woman's arm over his shoulder. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, and the flames painted their faces in orange and gold. Together, they stumbled toward the exit, collapsing into the arms of firefighters waiting outside. The rain poured over them like mercy, washing away soot, tears, and the invisible weight of regret. They fell to their knees on the wet pavement, gasping for air, drenched in smoke and rain. Alexander turned toward Sophia, her face lit by the flickering glow of emergency lights. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but also a strange peace. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. In that quiet moment, their silence said everything words could not. Moments later, an ambulance arrived with news. Emily had been rescued alive, hurt but safe. Sophia froze, tears blurring her vision as relief overtook her. Alexander instinctively reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. The fire had burned away the distance between them. In that moment, millionaire and housekeeper ceased to exist. Only two souls surviving grief and grace. At the hospital, white light replaced the orange glow of the flames. Sophia sat beside Emily's hospital bed, holding her daughter's hand between her own. Her face was streaked with ash and tears, yet she radiated strength. Alexander stood in the doorway, silent, watching a woman who had walked through fire and emerged unbroken. She turned to him, voice soft but steady. "Now I understand. You weren't trying to repay a debt. You were trying to redeem yourself." The words struck him harder than the heat of the fire ever could. He lowered his head, and for the first time in years, he wept without hiding. Outside, the rain kept falling, as if the sky itself was washing away what the fire could not destroy. The hospital was drenched in silence, broken only by the steady beeping of heart monitors. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with the stale aroma of old coffee. Alexander Reed walked down the corridor with slow, heavy steps, his suit wrinkled, his eyes red from sleeplessness. He had spent the entire night awake, trapped between guilt and fear. The millionaire who once ruled empires now felt small in the face of a simple hospital room. Inside, Sofia Morales sat quietly beside Emily's bed. The girl slept peacefully, her arms wrapped in bandages, a small cut on her cheek. Sophia held her daughter's hand, her gaze fixed in the distance. Fatigue had stripped her of any vanity. All that remained was a mother's quiet faith. When Alexander entered, she didn't turn around. But she felt him. He approached silently, the sound of his wet shoes echoing against the tile floor. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure how to begin. How often does a man learn to speak about business, but never about regret? He swallowed hard, then whispered, "Sophia, there's something I need to tell you." His voice trembled. For the first time, it sounded human. Sophia lifted her gaze, and what she saw wasn't the proud millionaire, but a man stripped of armor. Alexander told her everything: the accident, his daughter, the night a firefighter risked his life to save her. When he said the name Michael Harris Morales, the air seemed to vanish from the room. Sophia froze, tears welling in her eyes. Fate, after all, has a cruel sense of poetry. As he spoke, it felt as though the camera of life circled around them, slowly revealing every unspoken truth. Alexander, the man made of glass, was finally breaking from within. He spoke of guilt, of loss, of the cold control that had become his shield. And then came the confession he had never shared. I wanted to die that day, because a good man died because of me. His voice cracked. He lowered his head. Sophia took a deep breath, tears rolling down her face. The silence that followed was long, but it was the kind that heals. She stood, walked toward him, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Life has taken much from me," she said softly, "but it gave me something greater. The truth about what really matters." Her words pierced through him like light through glass. Alexander looked at her, stunned by the peace in her eyes. In that moment, he understood that forgiveness isn't charity, it's freedom. And Sophia, the housekeeper he had once tried to help with money, was now helping him with something infinitely greater: humanity. He held her hand quietly, and this time she didn't pull away. Outside, the sun began to rise, painting the clouds in shades of gold and rose. The rain had stopped, and the faint drip of water against the windowsill filled the silence. The reflection of dawn illuminated their faces as if the entire universe had paused for this moment. It was the end of guilt, and the beginning of redemption. While Emily slept, a new kind of silence filled the room. It was no longer the silence of pain, but of peace, the kind that comes when truth is finally spoken. Alexander knew this moment would change everything. Sophia knew it too. And between tears, faith, and forgiveness, two worlds that once collided finally met, not by fate, but by choice. The headlines the next day felt almost unreal. Millionaire resigns from empire and announces new foundation. Alexander Reed's name spread across the papers in New York, London, and Beverly Hills. Some called him insane. Others called him enlightened. But those who truly looked into his eyes saw something simpler: the quiet weight of a man who finally understood that money is just a shining mirror for an empty heart. He had decided to begin again. The official announcement took place in a modest auditorium filled with natural light. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Beside him stood Sophia Morales, the same housekeeper he once treated as invisible. Now she was the face and soul of the Harris Foundation, named after the firefighter Michael Harris Morales, the man who had given his life for love. As Alexander spoke, his voice trembled, not from weakness but from truth. He spoke about second chances, about compassion, and about how wealth without purpose is nothing but rusted gold. "I built towers that touched the sky," he said, "but I never learned to touch a heart." Sophia stood beside him, silent, her warm brown eyes reflecting a quiet faith that words could never teach. The foundation was born with a simple but profound mission: to rebuild lives. They began by helping families who had lost everything to fires, tragedies, and disasters. The same stories Alexander used to ignore in his boardrooms. And it was Sophia who insisted, "It's not enough to give. You have to show up." And so the millionaire learned to serve. Together they visited forgotten communities, shelters, and orphanages. Alexander, once a man of glass and numbers, now knelt down to listen to children and the elderly. In one of their trips, a little girl with Emily's same bright smile hugged him and whispered, "Thank you for seeing us." The words shattered something inside him. The man who once thought he had everything finally understood what it meant to be rich. Sophia emerged as a natural leader. Her empathy, faith, and grounded wisdom inspired everyone around her. She was the calm to Alexander's restlessness, the anchor to his new purpose. "It's not about what you've lost," she would say. "It's about what you decide to do with what's left." Her words became the foundation's motto and its beating heart. Gradually, the public began to admire the former billionaire not for what he owned, but for what he gave back. Yet behind the glass walls of his old corporation, the story was different. Charles Davenport, his longtime partner, watched with contempt. "He's lost his mind," he sneered. "He's ruining everything we built." Envy, like rust, had begun to spread. While Alexander grew as a man, the empire he left behind began to crumble. Investors complained, the media questioned, and the board demanded answers. But he no longer feared loss, because for the first time he possessed something money could never buy: peace. Still, the corporate world does not forgive those who choose humanity over profit. One late afternoon, while reviewing Foundation reports, Alexander's phone rang. On the other end, a cold voice from the board said, "You are officially removed as CEO." He remained silent for a long moment, then turned toward the window and smiled faintly. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady, like an old friend returning to remind him that every rebirth begins with pain and hope washing over the ruins. The city lights sparkled outside, but inside Alexander Reed's apartment, darkness reigned. The man who once graced magazine covers now lived among half-open boxes and faded memories. The voices of the corporate world had gone silent, replaced by a haunting echo, the sound of his own conscience. The millionaire who once owned everything now found himself with nothing, and paradoxically freer than ever before. Sofia Morales searched for him. She looked through hospitals, churches, and quiet hotels. The foundation continued to function, but without him it felt hollow, like a body without a heartbeat. "He needs to come back," she told the volunteers. Yet deep down, Sofia knew, some healings happen only in silence. Sometimes you must get completely lost to find faith again. One cold evening, Sofia received an unmarked envelope. The paper was simple, her name written by hand: Sofia Morales. Inside, there was a letter and a small key. Alexander's handwriting was firm, yet serene, the kind that belongs to someone who has already said goodbye. She sat at the table, hands trembling, and began to read. "When the sky grows dark," the first line said, "remember, the rain is just God's way of washing away the pain." Those words could hardly belong to the same man who once believed in nothing but numbers. He wrote about regret, about time wasted trying to buy what could only be given: love, forgiveness, presence. And he confessed that above all, Sofia had been the most unexpected miracle of his life. The letter described distant places, simple, filled with laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and children's voices. Alexander wrote that he needed to finish what he had started, not in business but within himself. "You taught me what it means to serve," he wrote. "Now I must learn how to stay." Every line felt like a farewell, yet also a promise. As she read, Sofia felt her chest tighten. The key, small and worn, had the letters HF engraved, Harris Foundation. She realized destiny was calling her again and that this story wasn't over yet. The letter ended with a final line: "When the rain falls again, follow the address below. It's where I left everything I've learned." Tears filled Sofia's eyes. She pressed the letter to her chest and took a deep breath as if embracing the inevitable. Emily, now recovered, appeared at the doorway and asked, "Mom, it's from him, isn't it?" Sofia nodded softly. "Are we going to find him?" The girl continued. Sofia smiled faintly. "Yes, sweetheart, but when the time is right." In the days that followed, life went on, but Sofia saw the world differently. The silence left by Alexander echoed through every street, every rainfall. Sometimes love doesn't need presence, it needs meaning. And in that waiting, she finally understood. What they shared was never a debt. It was a purpose. Across the country, under a gray sky, Alexander Reed walked along a dirt road surrounded by misty hills. The wind tugged at his dark coat and his expression was peaceful. For the first time in decades, he wasn't heading anywhere. He was simply existing. And the path, silent and damp, seemed to lead him toward a new beginning. The road ended before an old iron gate covered in moss and wet leaves. Sofia Morales, the letter still tucked in her pocket, looked at the place Alexander Reed had described. The sound of gentle rain mixed with the whisper of the wind through the trees. There was something sacred in that silence, as if time itself had paused for this reunion. Emily held her hand, eyes wide with curiosity and hope. When the gate creaked open, they saw a modest white-painted building, an orphanage. Curtains fluttered in the windows and children's laughter echoed from inside. The sign on the wooden post read, "Harris Home of Hope." Sofia's heart tightened, not with pain but with recognition. The rain began to fall harder, washing away everything the past had stained. Inside, Alexander Reed sat in a small room surrounded by children's drawings. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his face calm, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain. He looked like a different man, not the cold millionaire from before, but someone who had finally made peace with his reflection. When he heard footsteps approaching, he stood slowly as if savoring the weight of each second. Sophia stopped at the doorway. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. There was no distance anymore, only understanding. Emily ran to Alexander and wrapped her arms around him, her tears mixing with the rain on his shirt. He held her gently, eyes filled with emotion. The sound of the rain on the roof became the soundtrack of a forgiveness that needed no words. Alexander took a step toward Sophia. She smiled, and in that simple gesture, there was more meaning than in 1,000 apologies. Neither of them spoke of the past. Neither mentioned the pain. All that existed was the present, the touch of their hands, the warmth of reconciliation, the distant sound of children laughing beneath the storm. As they walked through the orphanage halls together, Sophia noticed the photos on the walls, families, volunteers, smiling faces. In every picture, the same emblem, the Harris Foundation logo. Alexander had turned his guilt into something living, tangible, human. And in that moment, she understood that true wealth had never been in what he owned, but in what he finally chose to give. Emily, full of excitement, pulled them outside. The rain was still falling, but now it felt soft and almost sweet. They stood there in the courtyard beneath the gray sky, letting the water soak them without fear. Time slowed. Alexander looked at Sophia and whispered softly, "You were the rain." She smiled. "And you finally let it wash you." The imaginary camera pulls back, revealing the three of them embraced under the rain, surrounded by laughing children. The orphanage glows in the background, its windows shining like gold. The sound of rain blends with laughter and the gentle music of the wind. The man who once had everything now possessed only what truly mattered, and it was enough. The final shot shows the clouds parting slowly, a single ray of sunlight touching the wet ground. The rain fades. Emily tilts her face toward the sky and laughs. Sophia and Alexander walk side by side toward the gate, their steps light, their hearts clean. The camera rises, capturing the orphanage in full, a symbol of renewal. Fade out. Sometimes life teaches us through the most unexpected moments. A millionaire can have everything and still live in silence on the inside, while a cleaning woman with tired hands and a steady soul carries a strength money could never buy. The truth is, the rain falls on everyone, the powerful and the humble, but it only transforms those who choose not to run from it. Just like Alexander and Sophia, maybe what you fear the most today is actually what will purify you tomorrow. So think about it. What is your rain trying to teach you? Sometimes a new beginning comes disguised as a loss, and forgiveness arrives just when you're ready to give up. If this story touched something inside you, it's because in some way it's also about you. And if you want to keep hearing stories that heal, inspire, and awaken the best in you, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. The next story might just be the one that changes how you see life.